The rain wasn't just falling, it was a physical weight, pressing the city into silence. Neon bled in shimmering streaks across the slick black asphalt. A watercolor painting dissolving before my eyes. My own reflection in a darkened storefront window was a ghost. A soaked, hollowed-out version of the woman who'd left for her double shift 14 hours ago. Now, all I had was the ache in my feet and the thin, useless fabric of a coat that had surrendered to the storm an hour back. That was when I saw it. A sleek black car, idling by the curb like a patient predator, its interior a void of promised warmth. I didn't think. I only felt the cold, a deep cellular chill that made my bones buzz. My hand was on the handle before my brain could protest. The heavy, expensive thunk of the door, a sound of salvation. "Home, please," I whispered, my voice a ragged apology, sliding into the plush leather seat without looking at the driver. The world outside vanished, replaced by a cocoon of quiet and the clean scent of something I couldn't name. Ozone and expensive wool. The engine didn't roar, it hummed, a low thrum of power that vibrated through the floor. It was the deepest silence I had ever known, a silence that held a breath. And in that held breath, I knew I had made a terrible, irreversible mistake. His voice, when it finally came, wasn't meant for a stranger. It was low and certain, a sound that seemed to absorb all the light in the car. "You got in the wrong car, sweetheart. Now you're mine until morning." My heart didn't just pound, it seized, a painful, stuttering lurch against my ribs. I finally looked up, my eyes tracing the silhouette of the man in the driver's seat. He was large, his shoulders broad under a dark coat, his profile sharp and unyielding in the fleeting glow of passing streetlights. He hadn't turned around. He didn't need to. The authority in his voice was absolute. My hand flew to the door handle, my fingers fumbling with the cold, smooth metal. I pulled. Nothing. I pulled again, a frantic, useless jerk. A soft click echoed from the dashboard, the sound of a final lock engaging, a cage door shutting. "Don't," he said. It wasn't a command so much as a statement of fact. As if the thought of my escape was a physical impossibility he'd already dismissed. My breath hitched. My tired, shivering body was now rigid with a completely different kind of cold. "Please," I managed, the word thin and fragile. I thought you were a taxi. I don't have any money. I have nothing." He was silent for a long moment. The only sounds the rhythmic sweep of the windshield wipers and the soft hiss of the tires on wet pavement. We were moving fast, the familiar landscape of my neighborhood blurring into an unrecognizable smear of light and shadow. We weren't heading toward the cluster of rundown brick buildings I called home. We were gliding toward the heart of the city, toward the gleaming spires of glass and steel where people like me were invisible. "I know what you have," he said, his voice still that same unnerving, quiet rumble. "You have my attention. For tonight, that's more valuable than money." Panic was a wild bird beating its wings against the inside of my chest. I tried to think, to form a plan, but my mind was a washout of exhaustion and terror. Who was this man? What did he want? The scenarios that flickered through my head were ugly, violent things I'd only seen in movies. But his stillness, his unnerving calm, was somehow worse than any overt threat. He drove with an economy of motion, his hands steady on the wheel, his gaze fixed on the road ahead, as if this, abducting a stranger from a rain-swept street, was as mundane as buying groceries. The car descended into the earth, down a steep ramp into the hushed, brightly lit belly of a parking garage. It was spotless, the concrete floor polished to a mirror sheen. There were other expensive cars parked in designated bays, sleeping beasts of chrome and steel, but no other people. The engine cut out, and the silence that rushed in was absolute. It pressed in on me, heavy and suffocating. For a long moment, neither of us moved. I could hear the frantic beat of my own pulse in my ears, a desperate drum against the crushing quiet. He opened his door, and the interior light flickered on, illuminating him for the first time. He was older than I'd expected, maybe late 30s, with dark hair cut short and a face that looked like it was carved from granite. There were faint lines around his eyes, but they weren't from smiling. His gaze met mine in the rearview mirror, and my breath caught in my throat. His eyes were the color of a stormy sky, deep and unreadable, and they held me in place more effectively than any lock. He didn't look cruel. He looked inevitable. He got out and walked around to my side. I flinched as my door opened, expecting to be dragged out, but he simply stood there, holding the door, waiting. The rain hadn't reached this far underground, but I could smell it in the air, a clean, cold scent that did nothing to calm the fire of fear in my veins. My legs wouldn't move. They felt like lead. "Get out, Nora," he said. The sound of my own name on his lips was a physical shock, a jolt of ice water. How did he know my name? I hadn't said it. My wallet was buried deep in my pocket. My ID hidden. The question must have shown on my face, because a flicker of something, amusement, satisfaction, crossed his. "I make it my business to know things," he said, answering the unspoken question. "Now get out of the car, you're dripping on my leather." That mundane complaint, so utterly at odds with the terrifying situation, was what finally broke my paralysis. I moved, clumsy and stiff, my worn sneakers squeaking on the polished concrete. Once I was out, he shut the door with a soft, definitive click and led the way toward a plain metal door. He didn't touch me, didn't guide me, but I felt his presence behind me like a physical force, a wall of heat at my back that kept me from bolting. He pressed a keycard against a black panel and a green light blinked. We stepped into a private elevator, all brushed steel and dark wood. He pressed the top button, the one marked PH, and the doors slid silently shut. My reflection stared back at me from the polished walls, a pale, terrified stranger with wet, stringy hair plastered to her face. His reflection stood behind mine, a dark, imposing shadow, his face impassive. The elevator opened directly into the apartment, and I forgot how to breathe. It wasn't a home, it was a kingdom. An entire floor of a skyscraper with floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the entire glittering, rain-slicked city. The space was vast, minimalist, and achingly beautiful. Dark wood floors, a few pieces of severe, modern furniture, and an ocean of night and light outside the glass. I stood frozen in the entryway, my cheap, soaked coat dripping onto a floor that was probably worth more than everything I owned. I was a stray animal that had wandered into a museum, a piece of gutter trash in a palace. "There's a bathroom through there," he said, gesturing with his chin toward a hallway. "A robe behind the door. Leave your wet things on the floor. I'll have them taken care of." He walked past me, shrugging off his own coat and tossing it onto a chair. Underneath, he wore a simple, dark sweater that did little to hide the powerful build of his shoulders and chest. He moved to a bar in the corner of the room, the clink of a heavy glass decanter against a crystal tumbler the only sound. I didn't move. I couldn't. My mind was still catching up. He wasn't a kidnapper in the conventional sense. He wasn't dragging me to a basement. He was hosting me. The absurdity of it was nauseating. He poured 2 fingers of amber liquid into the glass and turned, leaning back against the bar. He watched me, his stormy eyes taking in my shivering frame, my chattering teeth. "You're shaking," he observed. "I'm cold," I said, my voice trembling. It was a lie. I was terrified. "Go," he said, his voice softer now, but no less commanding. "Get warm, we'll talk after." I went. I felt like a puppet whose strings he was holding, my own will completely gone. The bathroom was larger than my entire apartment. A vast walk-in shower with a rainfall head, a deep soaking tub, marble floors that were gently heated under my bare feet when I finally kicked off my soaked sneakers. A thick white robe hung on a hook, impossibly soft. I stripped off my cold, damp clothes, leaving them in a pathetic heap, and stepped into the shower, turning the water as hot as I could stand. The steam enveloped me, but it couldn't touch the ice deep inside me. I wasn't being rescued. I was being managed. I was a problem, a complication he was containing in the most luxurious way possible. When I emerged, wrapped in the cloud-like robe, my wet clothes were gone. In their place, on a small bench, were a pair of simple gray sweatpants and a black long-sleeved t-shirt. They were soft, new, and clearly men's, but they were blessedly dry. I pulled them on, the fabric swimming on my small frame. The sleeves hung down over my hands. I felt like a child playing dress-up in her father's clothes. I padded back out into the main room on silent, bare feet. He was standing by the windows, looking out at the city, the glass in his hand. The storm had lessened, the rain now just a fine mist that softened the lights below. He turned as I approached, his gaze sweeping over me. It wasn't leering or predatory, but it was intensely focused. An assessment that made my skin prickle. "Better?" he asked. I nodded, clutching the long sleeves of the shirt like a shield. "Who are you?" I asked. The question finally finding its way past the fear. He took a slow sip of his drink before answering. "My name is Cassian Marrow." He said it simply, as if it should mean something to me. It didn't. "And tonight, you became a witness to something you shouldn't have seen." My blood ran cold. "Seen? I didn't see anything. I just got in a car." "You saw the car," he corrected. "You saw the man driving it. In my world, that's more than enough. A business associate of mine was supposed to get in that car at that exact time. A deal was being made. Your spontaneity interrupted it." He took another sip, his eyes never leaving mine. It made my associate nervous. He doesn't like loose ends. He doesn't like surprises. The pieces clicked into place, forming a picture I didn't want to see. This was organized crime, mafia, the kind of thing you read about, the kind of thing that belonged to a different, more violent world. And I had stumbled right into the middle of it. I had opened the wrong door and fallen into another reality. "So what happens now?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. "Now," he said, setting his glass down with a soft click. "You stay here, where I can see you, where my associate knows you are under my control. Until he feels secure, until the business is concluded, you are a guest." His mouth twisted slightly, as if he knew how inadequate the word was. "It's safer for you this way." "Safer?" I laughed, a sharp, hysterical sound. "You've kidnapped me. You're holding me here against my will." "Would you rather be with my associate?" he asked, his voice dropping, losing all its earlier softness. It was flat, cold, and deadly serious. "He is not as patient as I am. His solution to a problem like you is much more permanent, so, yes, Nora, safer." The finality in his tone stole the air from my lungs. This was my reality now, a gilded cage high above the city, watched over by a man who moved in a world of shadows and violence. He was my captor, and he was my protector. The two ideas warred in my mind, creating a dizzying, terrifying confusion. Exhaustion, fear, and the sheer surreality of it all washed over me in a wave. I swayed on my feet, the vast, beautiful room tilting around me. His hand shot out, steadying me by my elbow. His grip was firm, his touch surprisingly warm through the sleeve of the shirt. It wasn't rough, but it was inescapable. For a second, I felt the rough texture of a callus on his thumb against my skin. It was the touch of a man who worked, but not with his hands in any way I could imagine. The contact sent a jolt through me, a strange current of fear and something else I couldn't identify. I looked up at him, and for a fleeting moment, the mask of control slipped. I saw a flicker of something in his eyes, not pity, but something more complex. A weariness, perhaps, a trace of regret. Then it was gone, replaced by the same cool, unreadable calm. "There's a guest room," he said, releasing my arm. "Down the hall. First door on the right. Get some sleep." He turned away from me, walking back toward the window, a clear dismissal. I stood there for a long moment, my arm tingling where he'd touched me. Sleep felt like an impossible dream, but as I walked on trembling legs toward the hallway he'd indicated, another sound reached me, a low vibration from the coffee table, his phone. He picked it up, his back still to me. "What?" he answered, his voice clipped and hard. I paused at the entrance to the hall, shrouded in shadow, and listened. A pause. Then his voice dropped even lower, a venomous hiss that was more terrifying than any shout. "You will not touch her, do you understand me? She didn't see your face. She saw mine. She belongs to me now. If you so much as look in her direction, I will burn your entire operation to the ground and salt the earth where it stood." He ended the call, the silence in the room pressing back in, heavier than before. He stood perfectly still for a long moment, his shoulders tight with a tension that seemed to vibrate through the floor. Then slowly he turned. His gaze scanned the room and landed directly on me, hidden in the darkness of the hallway. He knew I'd been listening. He knew I'd heard every chilling, possessive word, and in his eyes, I saw not the protector, not the reluctant host, but the wolf whose territory I had mistakenly entered. I wasn't his guest, I was his property. And I had just heard the price of my life being set. His eyes held mine across the expanse of the silent, cavernous room. There was no anger in them, no surprise, just a flat, cold acknowledgement. He knew I'd heard. He'd probably known I was there the entire time, a frightened mouse hiding in the shadows of his palace. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. He simply inclined his head, a barely perceptible gesture toward the hallway. A dismissal, an order, go, my feet obeyed before my mind did. Carrying me on numb legs into the darkness of the corridor, I didn't dare look back. I found the first door on the right and slipped inside, shutting it behind me with a soft click that sounded like a gunshot in the oppressive quiet. I didn't turn on the light. I leaned my back against the cool wood of the door, my body trembling, not with cold, but with the aftershock of his words. She belongs to me now. The possessiveness of it was a brand, a claim staked on my life without my permission. The threat that followed, the promise of burning another man's world to the ground, was not a comfort. It was a terrifying glimpse of the power this man wielded, the casual violence that was the currency of his world. He wasn't protecting me out of kindness. He was protecting an asset, a complication that was now his to manage. I was a loose end he had tied to himself. The room was as impersonal and luxurious as the rest of the penthouse. A large, low bed with a mountain of pillows, a sleek black dresser, another wall of glass, with a view of the city's electric heartbeat. It was a 5-star hotel suite, designed to be beautiful but forgettable, a place no one ever truly lived in, a cage, no matter how gilded. I crossed the plush carpet and sank onto the edge of the bed, the mattress giving way beneath my slight weight. Sleep was an ocean away. My mind was a storm of images and sounds. The slick, wet street, the heavy thunk of the car door, the low, certain timbre of his voice, the venom in his tone on the phone. I wrapped my arms around myself, the borrowed shirt soft against my skin, but I couldn't get warm. The chill was in my bones, a deep primal fear. Who was the man on the phone? The associate who didn't like surprises? And what kind of man was Cassian Marrow, who could speak of such destruction with such calm? I was caught between two monsters, and my safety depended entirely on the whims of the one who had claimed me. The thought was suffocating. I lay back, pulling the thick duvet over my body, and stared into the darkness, listening for any sound from the other room. But there was only silence. The profound, unnerving silence of a predator at rest. I must have drifted off, because the next thing I knew, pale gray light was filtering through the windows. The rain had stopped. The city below was waking up. A distant, muted hum of traffic rising from the streets. For a disorienting second, I didn't know where I was. Then it all came crashing back, and the fear was a sour taste in my mouth. I lay still for a long time, my heart a frantic, trapped thing in my chest. I had to get out. The thought was a desperate, foolish spark. But where would I go? He knew my name. He'd find me. And even if I did escape him, the other man, the one Cassian had threatened, would be looking for me too. Cassian's words echoed in my mind. His solution to a problem like you is much more permanent. I was trapped. My only move was to stay still and pray. Eventually, thirst and a desperate need to know what was happening on the other side of the door forced me to move. I slipped out of bed, my bare feet silent on the floor. I crept to the door and listened. Nothing. Taking a deep breath, I turned the handle and pulled it open, wincing at the tiny sound it made. The main room was flooded with the cool, indirect light of morning, and he was there. He was sitting in one of the severe armchairs, facing the windows, a tablet resting in his lap. He was dressed in a simple pair of dark gray trousers and a black Henley, the sleeves pushed up to his elbows. He looked different in the daylight, less like a creature of the night and more like a man, a dangerously still man. He didn't look up, but I knew he was aware of me. The air in the room had shifted, tightened. "There's coffee," he said, his voice quiet, matter-of-fact. He gestured with his chin toward the kitchen area, his eyes still on the tablet. I moved toward the bar, my muscles tensed, ready to bolt. A sleek silver coffee machine was humming softly, a full pot of black coffee sitting on its hot plate. Beside it was a plate with a croissant and a small bowl of fruit. My stomach growled a humiliating betrayal. I hadn't eaten in nearly 24 hours. Silently, I poured myself a mug of coffee, my hand shaking so badly that the ceramic rattled against the pot. I took the food not because I wanted it, but because it felt like refusing would be a challenge, a stupid, pointless act of defiance. I perched on a stool at the kitchen island, as far away from him as I could get, and forced myself to take a bite of the croissant. It was buttery and flaky and tasted like ash in my mouth. We sat in silence for what felt like an eternity, the only sounds the soft clicks of his finger on the tablet screen and the distant symphony of the city. The quiet was a weapon, and he wielded it with terrifying skill. "How long?" I finally asked, my voice raspy. I needed to know. I needed a timeline, an endpoint to this waking nightmare. He looked up from the tablet then, and his stormy gray eyes pinned me to the stool. "As long as it takes." "And what if your associate decides he's not feeling secure?" I pressed, a flicker of my old self, the one who wasn't a terrified captive, sparking to life. "What if he decides I'm too much of a risk?" A muscle tightened in his jaw. He set the tablet down on the small table beside him. "He won't," he said, his voice flat, "because he knows what I will do to him if he tries." He held my gaze, and there was no mistaking the deadly promise in his eyes. He wasn't just reassuring me. He was stating a fact, as absolute and immovable as gravity. "You are safer here with me than you have ever been in your entire life, Nora." The bitter irony of that statement was a punch to the gut. I was safer with the man who had stolen my freedom, the man who spoke of burning and destruction as if he were discussing the weather. I looked away from him, out the window. The world was moving on without me. People were going to work, living their lives, completely oblivious to the fact that a woman was being held prisoner in a glass tower high above their heads. The feeling of isolation was crushing. He stood up and I flinched, my whole body tensing. He wasn't looking at me. He walked to the coffee machine to refill his mug. He moved with a quiet, contained grace that was at odds with his size. He was a man comfortable with his own power, a man who never had to raise his voice. As he reached for the pot, the sleeve of his Henley pulled taut, then slid down his forearm. And I saw them, scars, not one or two, but a pale, latticed network of them, crisscrossing the tanned skin of his inner arm. They were old, silvery white against his skin, but they were deep. One, a jagged line that ran from his wrist almost to his elbow, looked like a blade had been dragged deep into the flesh. Another was a puckered, round scar that could only have been made by a bullet. It was a roadmap of violence, etched into his very skin. The threats he made weren't just words. He had lived them. He had survived them. My breath hitched, a small, involuntary gasp. His movements stilled. He hadn't seen me look, but he'd heard. He knew. Slowly, deliberately, he set the coffee pot down. He didn't look at me. He simply tugged his sleeve back down, covering the violent history written on his arm. The gesture was calm, methodical, but it felt as final as a door slamming shut. He had let me see a piece of him, a crack in the granite facade, and now he was sealing it back up. The silence that followed was different. It was heavier, charged with the thing we both now knew but would not speak of. The abstract danger had become horrifyingly concrete. It had a texture, a shape, a history carved into the body of the man. Standing 20 feet away from me, he picked up his mug and walked not back to his chair, but toward the wall of windows, his back to me. He stood there, a dark silhouette against the morning light, looking out at the city that was his kingdom. I stayed on my stool, my heart hammering against my ribs. I felt like I was sharing a cage with a wolf, and I had just been reminded, in the most visceral way possible, of its teeth. The day stretched on in an agony of silence. I retreated back to my room, but the quiet was no comfort. I could feel his presence in the apartment, a constant, low-level hum of energy that kept me on edge. I felt like a ghost, haunting the edges of his life, invisible until he chose to look at me. Late in the afternoon, as the sun began to dip and the city lights started to glitter to life, a sharp electronic chime cut through the silence, the sound of the private elevator arriving. I froze in the doorway of my room. Across the living area, Cassian's entire body went rigid. The stillness he'd worn all day was gone, replaced by a coiled, watchful tension. He turned his head and looked directly at me, and his eyes were dark with an urgency that chilled me to the bone. "Go to your room," he said, his voice a low, hard command. "Lock the door, do not come out, and do not make a sound, no matter what you hear." His tone left no room for argument. It was the voice of a commander on a battlefield, a king giving an absolute decree. I didn't hesitate. I backed into my room, my eyes locked on his, 1,000 terrifying questions screaming in my mind. The soft ding of the elevator arriving echoed in the apartment. I shut my door, my hand trembling as I twisted the lock. The final sound I heard was the heavy, solid thud of the main door to the penthouse swinging open. Then, silence. I pressed my ear against the cool wood of the door, my own breathing loud and ragged in the suffocating silence. My world had shrunk to this single point of contact, this flimsy barrier between me and the unknown danger that had just arrived. Muffled voices drifted from the other room, deep and masculine. One was Cassian's, a low, controlled rumble, the sound of a slow-moving river. The other was different, smoother, with a lilting, almost pleasant cadence that was somehow more menacing than a shout. I couldn't make out most of the words, just fragments that snagged in my mind like thorns. "Unnecessary complication," the smooth voice purred, then Cassian's, colder than ice. "My business." I heard the word girl and felt a sickening lurch in my stomach. Then liability. A long pause. I held my breath, my muscles screaming with tension. The smooth voice spoke again, closer this time, its pleasant tone curdling into something sharp and ugly. "A loose end, Cassian. You know how we feel about loose ends." Then it happened. A sudden, violent sound, the sharp, explosive crack of shattering glass, followed by a dull, fleshy impact, a choked-off grunt of pain. My heart leaped into my throat. I squeezed my eyes shut, picturing 1,000 horrible things. A fight, a gunshot. I waited for the blast, for the shout, for the sound of bodies hitting the floor. But there was nothing. Only a profound, ringing silence that was somehow worse than the noise. It stretched on for an eternity. I imagined Cassian lying on the floor, bleeding. I imagined the smooth-voiced man standing over him, turning his attention to my locked door. My hand flew to my mouth to stifle a sob. The fear was no longer just for myself. An electronic chime, the elevator, the heavy final sound of the penthouse door opening, then closing, and then silence again. The crushing, absolute silence of the aftermath. I stayed frozen, my ears still pressed to the door. For how long, I don't know. Minutes? An hour? Every creak of the building, every whisper of the ventilation system, was the sound of a footstep, of someone coming for me. Finally, a soft knock on my door. I jumped back as if I'd been burned, my heart hammering against my ribs. "Nora." It was his voice, Cassian's. It was quiet, calm, but I could hear the slightest roughness around the edges, like a fraying rope. Relief and terror warred inside me, a nauseating cocktail. I crept back to the door, my hand trembling as I reached for the lock. I twisted it slowly, the click echoing in the small room. I pulled the door open just a crack and peered out. He was standing there, a few feet away. He looked unchanged. His clothes weren't torn, his hair was perfectly in place, but the air around him was different. It was charged, electric with the residue of violence, and the room beyond him was not the same. A faint coppery scent hung in the air, a smell I knew instinctively was blood. Near the bar, a spiderweb of shattered crystal glittered on the dark wood floor. He watched me take it all in. His face an unreadable mask, but his stormy eyes were dark, turbulent. "Are you all right?" he asked. The question, so simple, so mundane, felt monumental. He wasn't asking if I had been physically harmed. He was asking if I was breaking. I could only nod, my throat too tight for words. He gave a curt nod in return, and turned away, moving toward the mess on the floor. He retrieved a dustpan and brush from a utility closet I hadn't known existed. He began to sweep up the broken glass with an efficient, detached precision, as if it were the most normal thing in the world. But I saw it. The slight tremor in his hand as he held the brush, a barely perceptible unsteadiness that betrayed the iron control he projected. And then I saw something else. As he bent down, the sleeve of his black Henley pulled up slightly, and I saw a dark, wet stain spreading across his knuckles, seeping into the fabric. Blood. "You're hurt," I said, the words escaping before I could stop them. He didn't look up. "It's nothing." "It's not nothing," I insisted, stepping out of the room, drawn forward by an impulse I didn't understand. "You're bleeding." He finished sweeping the last of the glass into the pan and stood up, his back still to me. "It will stop." "Let me see," I said, my voice gaining a sliver of strength. I wasn't a prisoner in that moment. I was just a person talking to another person who was hurt. It was a feeling so normal it was dizzying. He was still for a long moment. I thought he would refuse, that he would shut me down with a cold word and retreat back behind his walls. But then slowly he turned. He looked at me, his gaze intense, searching. Then he held out his hand. His knuckles were split open, a raw, angry gash across the back of his hand, welling with dark blood. It was the hand that had held the steering wheel, the hand that had steadied my arm, the hand of a man who had just committed an act of violence to protect me. "The bathroom," I said, my own voice surprising me with its steadiness. "There must be a first aid kit." He followed me without a word. I rummaged through the drawers in the palatial bathroom, my hands moving with purpose. Under the sink, behind a stack of impossibly fluffy towels, I found a sleek black box with a simple red cross on it. I opened it on the marble countertop. It was filled with everything I could possibly need. I ran a cloth under warm water and turned back to him. He was leaning against the door frame, watching me, his large frame filling the space. He seemed to suck all the air out of the room. I motioned for him to come closer, and he did, extending his wounded hand over the sink. My fingers trembled as I took his hand in mine. His skin was warm, his hand dwarfing my own. I gently dabbed at the blood with the warm cloth, my touch as light as I could make it. He didn't flinch, didn't make a sound, but I felt the muscles in his forearm tense under my grasp. I was acutely aware of everything: the rough texture of his skin, the surprising softness of the hairs on his arm, the solid weight of him. I could feel his pulse, a steady, slow beat beneath his wrist. I worked in silence, cleaning the wound with an antiseptic wipe, the sharp, clean smell cutting through the metallic scent of blood. His scars, the pale white roadmap of his violent past, were stark against his skin, so close to my fingers. This new wound, red and raw, was just one more mark on a life defined by them. He watched me the entire time, his gaze never leaving my face. He wasn't looking at what I was doing, he was looking at me. It was an unnerving, intimate scrutiny, and I felt a strange heat creep up my neck. I focused on my task, carefully wrapping a sterile white bandage around his knuckles, my movements deft and sure. It was a simple human act, a small moment of care in this place of cold luxury and hidden violence, and it changed the space between us. The air was thick with things we couldn't say, with the truth of what he'd done for me, with the terrifying reality of the debt I now owed. When I was finished, my hand lingered on his for a fraction of a second too long. I pulled back as if burned, tucking a stray piece of hair behind my ear. "There," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "Thank you," he said, his voice a low rumble. He flexed his bandaged hand, his gaze dropping to it for the first time. We stood there for a moment in the echoing silence of the marble bathroom. Then he turned and walked out, leaving me with the lingering warmth of his skin on my fingertips and the frantic, unsteady beat of my own heart. Later, he ordered food. It arrived via the private elevator, delivered by a silent man who didn't make eye contact and vanished as quickly as he appeared. It wasn't the extravagant meal I might have expected. It was a simple, fragrant Thai green curry with steaming jasmine rice. He set the containers on the kitchen island, and we ate, perched on opposite stools. The hostile silence of the morning had been replaced by something else, a fragile, temporary truce. It was still a silence, but it was no longer a weapon. It was a space to breathe. "Why flowers?" he asked, his voice startling me. I looked up from my plate. "What?" "You said you wanted to be a floral designer," he clarified, his eyes on his food. "Why?" The question was so normal, so unexpected, that it took me a moment to process. I don't know," I stammered. "I guess because they're quiet." You can create something beautiful, something that makes people happy, without having to say a word. They just exist. They're honest. He considered this for a moment, his expression thoughtful. Honest, he repeated, as if testing the word. I found myself telling him about it. About my tiny apartment with its fire escape full of pots and herbs. My one little rebellion against the concrete and steel. About how I'd spend my last few dollars on a bunch of wilting roses from the bodega, just to have something beautiful to look at. I told him about my dream of having a small shop, a place filled with light and the smell of earth and green things. I talked, and he listened. He didn't interrupt, didn't comment, just held my gaze across the island, his own food forgotten. He gave me his undivided attention, and in this place where I had no voice and no power, it felt like a gift. After we ate, he took the empty containers and disposed of them. A sense of strange domestic peace settled over the room. The city lights twinkled outside the vast windows, a silent, glittering ocean. For a fleeting, insane moment, it didn't feel like a prison, it just felt like a quiet night. Then his phone rang. The sound shattered the calm instantly. He pulled it from his pocket, and the transformation was immediate. The listener, the quiet man with the bandaged hand, vanished. In his place was Cashin Marrow, the cold, dangerous ruler of this kingdom. His face hardened into a mask of stone as he listened, his jaw tight. He said nothing, just absorbed the words coming from the other end. He ended the call and placed the phone face down on the counter. The silence that followed was the most terrifying yet. It was the calm before an earthquake. He raised his head and looked at me, and his eyes were flat, devoid of any of the warmth or connection I had imagined was there. They were the eyes of a stranger, the eyes of the man who had first spoken to me in the dark car. "He knows where you live," Cassian said, his voice a blade of ice. "The apartment on Vesper Street. He sent someone to your building to wait." My blood turned to ice water, my little fire escape garden, my worn-out armchair, my life. My whole world, the one I had been so desperate to get back to, was no longer safe. The other man, the one with the smooth voice, wasn't just a threat here, in this tower. He had reached into my past, into my home. He had poisoned it. Cassian pushed away from the counter, his movements sharp, urgent. "We have to go, now!" The cage had just become my only refuge. The monster had just become my only protector, and the world outside was no longer my own. Go where?" The words were a choked whisper, all the air stolen from my lungs. My apartment, my tiny sanctuary on Vesper Street, had been a beacon in my mind, the one place I could picture to keep myself sane. Now it was just another part of the nightmare, a trap waiting to be sprung. The thought of some faceless man sitting in the shadows of my hallway, waiting for me, made my skin crawl with a violation so profound it left me dizzy. Cassian was already moving, his earlier stillness shattered into 100 points of sharp, focused energy. "Just get your things, the clothes, whatever you have." He didn't look at me, his attention already elsewhere, his mind clearly racing several steps ahead. He pulled on a dark jacket, the same one he'd worn the night he took me, shrugging his broad shoulders into the expensive fabric. He moved to a panel on the wall I'd assumed was just decorative wood, pressing his thumb against an invisible sensor. It slid open with a soft hiss, revealing a sleek steel safe. He spun the dial with a practiced speed, the clicks precise and final. I stood frozen for a second, my mind struggling to catch up. Then the urgency in his voice finally penetrated my shock. I ran back to the guest room, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. My things consisted of the borrowed sweatpants and t-shirt, now folded neatly at the foot of the bed. My own clothes, the jeans and sweater I'd been wearing, now clean and perfectly pressed, were laid out on a chair. Someone had come in while I slept, had handled my belongings. The thought was another small, creeping violation. I pulled on my jeans, my fingers fumbling with the button. I grabbed the borrowed clothes, clutching them to my chest like a shield. It was all I had in this new, terrifying life. When I returned to the main room, Cassian was closing the safe. He slid 2 passports, neither of which, I was certain, bore his real name, and a thick stack of cash into an inner pocket of his jacket. Then he turned to a drawer beneath the bar and pulled out a gun. It was matte black, heavy and brutally efficient looking. He didn't handle it like a prop. He checked the magazine, the slide, the chamber, with an economy of motion that spoke of years of familiarity. The sight of it, lying starkly on the polished countertop, was the final horrifying confirmation of the world I was in. This wasn't a business dispute. This was a war, and I was standing on the front line with no armor. He slid the gun into a holster at the small of his back, the weapon disappearing beneath his jacket. He turned to me, his eyes sweeping over me. A quick, assessing glance. "Ready?" I could only nod, my throat tight. We went down in the private elevator, the silence thick with unspoken tension. My mind was reeling. Who was this man, really? A gangster? A mob boss? The name he'd given me, Cassian Marrow, felt like a carefully constructed facade. He was a man of safes and guns and aliases, a man who could order a life extinguished with a single phone call. And I was trusting my life to him. The absurdity of it was a bitter pill. We didn't exit into the pristine parking garage. He pressed a button for a lower level, one I hadn't seen. The doors opened onto a grimy, dimly lit service level. The air was thick with the smell of damp concrete and exhaust fumes. Parked in a dark corner was not the sleek black sedan from the first night, but a powerful dark gray SUV with tinted windows, its engine already humming. "Get in the back, stay down," he ordered, his hand on my elbow, guiding me swiftly toward the passenger side. He opened the door, and I scrambled in, huddling on the floor of the back seat, my cheek pressed against the cool, clean-smelling carpet. He shut the door, and a moment later, he was in the driver's seat. The vehicle moved with a low growl, peeling out of the garage and into the rain-slicked belly of the city. I stayed on the floor, my world a blur of passing streetlights seen through the bottom of the window. I could feel every turn, every acceleration through the floor of the car. He drove with a controlled aggression, weaving through traffic with a confidence that bordered on arrogance. He was a predator in his natural habitat. He made a few quick, sharp turns, doubling back on himself, his eyes constantly checking the mirrors. I could feel his vigilance, a palpable tension radiating from the front seat. He was checking for a tail. After a few minutes of this, he seemed satisfied. "You can sit up," he said, his voice a low command. I pulled myself onto the leather seat, my legs shaky. The city rushed past us, a river of light and shadow. We weren't heading for the glittering downtown spires or the rundown familiarity of my neighborhood. We were heading east toward the industrial district, a place of warehouses and empty lots that bordered the dark, churning river. "Where are we going?" I asked, my voice small. "Somewhere safe," he answered, his gaze fixed on the road. "A place he doesn't know about." The implication was chilling. There were places the other man did know about, places Cassian frequented. His world wasn't as impenetrable as his penthouse fortress had made it seem. He had vulnerabilities. We pulled into a deserted alley between two towering brick warehouses, the windows dark and blind. He cut the engine, and the sudden silence was deafening. He got out and came around to my side, his hand resting almost unconsciously on the spot where his gun was concealed. He scanned the alley, his head on a constant, subtle swivel, taking in every shadow, every flicker of movement. He was a man who lived with danger as a constant companion. He led me to a heavy steel door, unmarked and anonymous. He unlocked a series of deadbolts, the sound of the tumblers clicking over loud in the night air. He pushed the door open into absolute blackness. "Inside," he whispered, his hand on my back, urging me forward. I stepped into the void, my heart pounding. He followed, shutting and locking the door behind us. For a moment we were in complete, disorienting darkness. I could hear him breathing softly beside me. Then, a click, and a single low-wattage bulb flickered on, casting a pool of sickly yellow light. We were in a massive open space. The air was cool and smelled of dust, old wood, and something faintly floral, like dried roses. The floor was raw concrete, and the ceiling was a web of steel rafters and shadows far above our heads. In the center of the vast room, under the single light, was a long, rough-hewn wooden table surrounded by a mismatched collection of chairs. It looked like a set piece from a forgotten play, a lonely island in an ocean of darkness. "What is this place?" I whispered, my voice swallowed by the cavernous space. "A restaurant," he said, walking toward the table. "It belonged to my father. It's been closed for years." He ran his hand along the back of a wooden chair, his touch almost reverent. For the first time, I saw a flicker of genuine emotion in his eyes, a deep, abiding sadness. The granite facade had cracked again, and this time the fissure ran deeper. "He was a businessman, like you?" I asked, testing the waters. A bitter, humorless smile touched his lips. "He was a cook," he said. "A damn good one. He thought food could solve anything. A plate of pasta could broker peace. A glass of wine could mend a broken heart." He paused, his gaze lost in the shadows. "He was wrong." He gestured for me to sit at the table, and I did, choosing a sturdy-looking chair. He remained standing, a dark, restless shape pacing the edge of the light. "This man," I began, needing to understand, needing to put a name to the faceless threat that had upended my life. "The one who was at your apartment. The one who sent someone to my building. Who is he?" Cassian stopped pacing and turned to face me, his expression grim. "His name is Julian Valerius, and he and I are partners, of a sort." "Partners?" The word sounded obscene. "He wants me dead, and you call him a partner?" "Our world has a different set of rules, Nora," he said, his voice hard. "Loyalty is a commodity. Trust is a weakness. Julian sees you as a loose thread in a very expensive tapestry. His instinct is to burn the thread before it can unravel the whole thing. My instinct is to control it." He looked at me, and his gaze was heavy, intense. "He thinks I'm a fool for keeping you alive. He thinks it's a sentiment I can't afford." The ghost of his father seemed to hang in the air between us, a silent testament to the cost of sentiment in their world. Cassian's father, the cook who believed in peace and pasta, had been wrong, and Cassian had learned that lesson well. He was a man who dealt not in food and wine, but in control and violence. "What was the deal?" I asked, the question that had been burning in my mind since that first night. "The one I interrupted?" He was silent for a long moment, studying me. I felt like he was weighing my life, my worth, my ability to handle the truth. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and even. "Valerius was acquiring a new asset, information, highly sensitive data from a competitor. The exchange was supposed to be a ghost operation, untraceable. Your appearance in my car, at that exact moment, made it traceable. It created a witness, you. So that was it. I wasn't just a random person in the wrong place. I was a witness to a crime that could unravel empires." "So you'll just keep me?" I asked, the words tasting like poison. "Locked away in penthouses and abandoned restaurants? For how long? Forever?" He walked over to the table and sat down opposite me. The single bulb overhead cast deep shadows across his face, making it impossible to read his expression. "I will keep you safe," he said, his voice a low, raw thing. "I gave my word." "Whose word?" I shot back, a surge of anger cutting through my fear. "You threatened to burn his world to the ground. That's not a promise. That's a declaration of war." "In my world," he said, leaning forward, his bandaged hand resting on the table between us. "They are the same thing." We sat in silence, the weight of his words pressing down on me. I was a pawn in a game I didn't understand, a game played by men like Cassian and Julian Valerius, men who saw people as assets and liabilities. The only thing keeping me alive was this man's possessive, violent form of protection, a protection that felt more like a cage every single day. I looked at his hand, at the white bandage stark against his tanned skin, a wound he'd gotten for me, a debt. I looked around the empty, cavernous room, at the ghost of a restaurant that had belonged to a man who believed in a better world. And I looked at his son, the man who had survived by becoming everything his father wasn't. The line between monster and protector had never been more blurred, and I was trapped on it, with no ground beneath my feet. I woke to the cold. It was a damp, creeping chill that had settled deep in my bones, a stark contrast to the sterile warmth of the penthouse. I was curled on a makeshift bed of old tablecloths in a dusty back office of the restaurant, the door left slightly ajar. The cavernous main room was filled with an expectant silence, broken only by the faint, rhythmic drip of a leaky pipe somewhere in the darkness. Pale, watery light filtered through the grimy, boarded-up windows, illuminating swirling dust motes in the air. This place felt like a tomb, a repository of dead dreams. The ghost of Cassian's father was a tangible presence here, in the lingering scent of dried herbs and the profound emptiness of the room. I found Cassian at the long wooden table, a ghost himself in the half-light. He was cleaning his gun, the parts laid out on a clean cloth with the precision of a surgeon's tools. The white bandage on his hand was a stark slash against his tanned skin. He didn't seem to have slept at all. His focus was absolute, his movements economical and sure. He looked up as I approached, his stormy eyes assessing, checking for cracks in my composure. "There's water, Sotter," he said, nodding toward a crate in the corner. "And some protein bars, not exactly room service." "It's fine," I said, my voice a croak. I took a bottle of water, the plastic crinkling loudly in the silence. I sat opposite him at the table, just as we had the night before. The distance between us felt both immense and non-existent. We were two strangers bound by a life-or-death pact, trapped in a forgotten memory. "How did he find my apartment so quickly?" I asked, the question that had been tormenting me all night. "You said your car wasn't followed." He slid the magazine back into his gun, with a final definitive click. "Valerius isn't a fool. He would have started digging into me the second you got in that car. My name isn't public, but the circles we move in are small. Someone who works for me, someone who knows my habits, mine properties. They could have been paid for information." The word hung in the air between us, betrayal. It was a poison that tainted everything, making our already precarious situation feel impossible. He had a traitor in his organization, a snake in his garden, which meant we weren't just running from Valerius. We were running from a shadow within Cassian's own world. "So we can't trust anyone," I whispered. He looked at me, his expression hard. "I don't trust anyone," he corrected. "And you will trust only me. Do you understand?" The command was absolute, leaving no room for doubt. He wasn't just offering protection, he was demanding my complete and total allegiance. In this world of shifting loyalties and hidden knives, he was making himself my one fixed point. I spent the morning exploring the edges of our prison, needing to move, to do something other than sit and wait for the axe to fall. The kitchen was a time capsule, covered in a thick layer of dust. Heavy copper pots hung from a rack, and a faded photograph was tacked to a corkboard on the wall. It was a picture of a younger Cassian, maybe 16 or 17, standing beside a proud, smiling man with flour on his apron. The man had Cassian's eyes, but his were filled with a light, a warmth that I had never seen in his son. They were standing in this very kitchen, beaming, a tray of fresh bread held between them. Cassian's arm was slung around his father's shoulders, and he had a genuine, unguarded smile on his face. He looked like a different person entirely, a boy with a future that didn't involve safes and guns and blood on his hands. I heard a floorboard creak behind me. I spun around, my heart in my throat. Cassian was standing in the doorway, his face unreadable. His gaze went from me to the photograph, and for a fleeting second, I saw a flicker of profound pain in his eyes, a deep, raw grief that he quickly masked. "He wanted me to take over," he said, his voice quiet, rough. "He wanted me to be a chef." He didn't understand that the world he'd built his restaurant in was changing. The men he served, the men whose patronage kept him safe. Their sons weren't interested in breaking bread. They were interested in breaking kneecaps. He looked away from the photo, his jaw tight. "When he died, I closed this place down. I locked the door and never came back. It was his dream. I couldn't let them turn it into a place to cut deals and hide bodies." The irony was crushing. He had preserved his father's dream by locking it away, only to bring me here, a living, breathing liability, turning it into the very thing he'd sought to avoid, a hiding place. He had brought his war to the one place he considered sacred. That's when we heard it. It wasn't a loud noise. It was a soft, metallic scrape from the front of the building, the sound of a lockpick sliding into an old, rusted mechanism. Cassian's transformation was instantaneous. The man who had been lost in a painful memory vanished. In his place was a predator. His eyes went dark, his body coiled. He moved toward me, his hand already reaching for the gun at his back. "The cellar," he hissed, his voice a low, urgent command. He grabbed my arm, his grip like steel, and pulled me out of the kitchen and across the main dining room. He kicked aside a dusty rug, revealing a heavy trapdoor with an iron ring. "Get in, do not make a sound, do not come out." "What about you?" I whispered, my voice trembling. "Go," he commanded, his eyes already fixed on the front of the restaurant, listening, calculating. He yanked the door open, revealing a set of steep stone steps leading down into musty darkness. I scrambled down, my hands scraping against the rough stone. He slammed the heavy door shut above me, and I was plunged into absolute blackness. The air was cold and thick with the smell of damp earth and rotting wood. I could hear the frantic beat of my own heart. Above me I heard the heavy front door of the restaurant groan open. Footsteps. More than one person, their boots crunching softly on the dusty floorboards. Silence. A tense, waiting silence that stretched my nerves to the breaking point. "We know you're in here, Marrow," a voice called out, the same smooth, lilting voice from the penthouse. "Julian Valerius." My blood ran cold. "And we know you have the girl. Send her out and we can end this with a minimum of fuss." Silence. I imagined Cassian, hidden in the shadows, a ghost in his own father's restaurant. "No, have it your way," Valerius's voice was laced with a theatrical sigh. The world exploded. The deafening roar of a shotgun blast echoed through the cavernous space, the sound vibrating through the floorboards into my bones. Then another, the sound of splintering wood. A sharp cry of pain, not Cassian's. Then the distinct, controlled crack, crack, crack of Cassian's handgun answering back. The fight was on. I huddled at the bottom of the stairs, my hands over my ears, my body shaking uncontrollably. Every gunshot was a physical blow. I heard men shouting, the heavy thud of a body falling, the shattering of glass. The sounds were terrifying, chaotic, but Cassian's shots were different. They were measured, precise. 2 shots, then silence. A pause, then one more. It was a grim, deadly rhythm. A heavy object crashed against the trapdoor above me, making me cry out. Then I heard scraping. They were trying to get to me. I scrambled backward into the darkness, my hands searching for a weapon, a hiding place, anything. My fingers closed around the splintered handle of an old shovel. The trapdoor splintered, and a sliver of dusty light cut through the darkness. A man's face appeared in the opening, a dark silhouette against the light. "Found her!" he yelled. He started to pry the door open wider. I didn't think. I just reacted. I gripped the shovel handle with both hands and swung it upward with all my might. A raw, terrified scream tearing from my throat. The heavy iron head connected with his face with a sickening, wet crunch. He screamed, a high, thin sound, and fell back, disappearing from the opening. Suddenly, the trapdoor was thrown open. Light flooded the cellar. Cassian stood there, his gun in his hand, his face a grim mask of fury. He looked down at the man I had hit, who was groaning on the floor. Then his eyes met mine. He saw the shovel in my hands, the terror and adrenaline on my face. A flicker of something, surprise, respect, crossed his features before he slammed the mask of control back into place. "We're leaving, now," he ordered, reaching a hand down to me. I took it, and he pulled me up out of the cellar in one smooth, powerful motion. The restaurant was a war zone. 2 bodies lay motionless on the floor in pools of spreading darkness. The long wooden table was overturned, shattered plates and glasses littering the floor. But Valerius was gone. Cassian was already pulling me toward the back of the kitchen. "There's a tunnel," he said, his voice tight. "Leads to the river." That's when I saw it. The dark, wet stain spreading across the side of his shirt, just below his ribs. "You're hit," I gasped. My hand flying to his side. He flinched, a sharp intake of breath the only sign of pain. "It's a graze. I'll live," he gritted out, pushing me forward. "We have to move." He kicked open a door at the back of a pantry, revealing a dark, narrow passage. The smell of river mud and decay washed over us. He shoved me inside, his body pressing against mine in the tight space. "Stay behind me," he whispered. We plunged into the darkness of the tunnel. Just as the kitchen door swung shut behind us, we heard the sound that froze my blood in my veins. Sirens, not one, but a dozen of them, growing closer, their wails echoing through the empty streets. Valerius hadn't just come to kill us. He had called the police. He was setting Cassian up to take the fall for the shootout, to be caught standing over 2 dead bodies with a gun in his hand. We were trapped. Trapped in a dark, forgotten tunnel beneath the city, with a traitor in our ranks, a killer on our heels, and the law closing in on our only exit. Cassian leaned against the rough brick of the tunnel wall, his breathing suddenly shallow, his hand pressed tight against his bleeding side. He looked at me, his eyes dark with a terrifying, desperate urgency. The trap had been sprung, and we were caught right in the center of it. The darkness in the tunnel was a living thing. It was cold, absolute, and smelled of a century of river damp and decay. The wail of the sirens was a physical pressure, squeezing the air from the narrow passage, getting closer with every frantic beat of my heart. Cassian sagged against the rough brick wall, his weight suddenly immense. The arm he'd thrown around my shoulders for balance was a dead weight, and his breathing was a ragged, shallow sound in the oppressive silence between siren calls. The adrenaline that had propelled us from the restaurant was draining away, leaving behind the stark, terrifying reality of our situation. He was hurt, badly, and we were trapped. "Keep moving," he grunted, the words tight with pain. He tried to push himself off the wall, but his legs buckled slightly. "No," I said, the words surprisingly firm. My own fear was a cold, hard knot in my stomach, but seeing him falter, seeing the invincible man begin to crumble, ignited something else in me, a fierce protective instinct I didn't know I possessed. "Stop. Let me see." "There's no time." "We'll make time," I insisted, turning to face him in the near-total darkness. I couldn't see his face, only the hulking outline of his silhouette. I reached out, my trembling fingers finding the wet, sticky patch on his side. He sucked in a sharp breath as I touched him, a sound of pure agony that he tried and failed to suppress. It was much worse than a graze. The fabric of his shirt was soaked through. "Nora, listen to me," he said, his voice low and urgent, laced with a desperation I'd never heard before. "At the end of this tunnel, there's a grate. It opens onto the embankment under the old steel bridge. If we get separated—" "We are not getting separated," I cut him off, my voice sharp. I tore a strip of fabric from the hem of my own t-shirt, my hands working automatically in the dark. It was a flimsy, useless gesture, but it was something. "I need to put pressure on it." I fumbled at his side, trying to push his jacket away. His hand clamped down on my wrist, his grip surprisingly strong. "Don't. You're bleeding, Cassian. You could bleed to death in this filthy tunnel." "It's better than the alternative," he bit out. For a second, I thought he meant being caught. But then he spoke again, and his words chilled me more than the damp air. "Valerius will not stop. If they catch me, he'll find a way to get to you. A cop on his payroll, a prison guard. He'll get the job done." He paused, his breath catching. "If I bleed out here, he might believe you're no longer my problem. He might let you go." I stared at the dark shape of him, my mind reeling. He was talking about dying, not as a possibility, but as a strategy, a final, desperate move in his brutal game. The thought of him lying cold and still on the muddy floor of this tunnel, all that coiled energy and dangerous life extinguished, was a physical blow. "No," I whispered, a raw, ragged sound. "That's not an option." I wrenched my wrist from his grasp and pushed his hand away from his side. I pressed the folded strip of my shirt against the wound hard. He let out a low groan, his entire body tensing against the wall. I held it there, my arm trembling with the effort, my palm slick with his blood. It was warm and terrifyingly real. "My left pocket," he gasped out, his head falling back against the brick. "The phone." I fumbled for his jacket pocket, my fingers brushing against the cold steel of a spare magazine, before closing around the sleek, heavy shape of his phone. "There's one contact," he said, his words coming slower now, slurred with pain and exhaustion. "Marco, tell him the Archangel has fallen. He'll know what it means. He'll get you out of the city. He'll set you up with a new life, money, papers, everything. He is the only one I trust." The devil's bargain. He was offering me my freedom, an escape. The life I'd been dreaming of since the moment I stepped into his car. A clean slate, a world away from Julian Valerius and men with guns. All I had to do was leave him here to die. "Take it, Nora," he urged, his voice a ghost of a whisper. "This was my mistake. You were never supposed to be a part of this. Take the out I'm giving you." I looked down at the phone in my hand. Its screen was a black mirror, reflecting nothing. I could make the call, I could run, I could disappear and become someone else. Someone who slept at night without the fear of footsteps in the hall. Someone who could dream of a little flower shop with a bell on the door. I could be free. The sirens had faded, replaced by the distant sound of search parties, their voices echoing eerily over the water. They were closing in. My hand was on his side, feeling the steady, warm pump of his lifeblood, a life he was willing to trade for mine. I thought of his bandaged knuckles, a wound he'd gotten protecting me. I thought of the way he'd listened, really listened, when I talked about my stupid, simple dreams. I thought of the haunted look in his eyes when he saw the photograph of his father. He wasn't just a monster, he was a man, broken and brutalized by the world he lived in, a world he had never chosen. And in his own violent, possessive way, he had kept me safe. To leave him now would be a betrayal, worse than any his organization could conceive of. It would be a betrayal of the strange, terrifying, and profound connection that had been forged between us in the crucible of fear and violence. It would be a betrayal of myself. "No," I said, my voice clear and steady in the darkness. "Don't be a fool," he rasped. "You don't get to decide for me," I said, my voice rising with a strength I didn't know I had. "Not anymore. You dragged me into your world, Cassian. You don't get to kick me out of it now just because it's inconvenient. You said I belonged to you. Well, now you belong to me. You're my problem. And I'm not leaving you to die in a sewer." I shoved his phone back into his pocket and wrapped his arm over my shoulders, taking on more of his weight. He was heavy, a dead weight of muscle and bone, but I staggered under the load, my feet finding purchase on the slick floor. "Which way to the grate?" He was silent for a long moment, and I could feel the struggle within him, the protector at war with the man who desperately needed to be saved. Finally, he gave a weak nod. "Forward." We moved through the darkness, a slow, agonizing shuffle. I was his crutch, his anchor. His blood was soaking through my sleeve, warm and sticky against my skin. Every step was a monumental effort. He leaned on me, his head bowed, his breathing a constant, painful rhythm in my ear. In the darkness, stripped of his power and his armor, he was just a man. And I was the only thing keeping him on his feet. We finally saw it. A faint latticed square of gray light ahead. The grate. As we drew closer, we could hear the river lapping against the stone embankment and the shouts of the police officers on the bridge above. They were directly over us. We huddled in the shadows just short of the opening. Cassian slumped against the wall, his eyes closed, his face pale and slick with sweat in the dim light. He was fading fast. We were out of time. My gaze swept our surroundings, my mind racing, searching for an escape that wasn't there. The river was black and fast-moving. We'd never make it swimming. The embankment was exposed. They'd see us in a second. Then I saw it. Chained to a thick iron ring on the wall was a small, flat-bottomed maintenance boat, the kind used to inspect the bridge pylons. It was old, covered in grime, half filled with murky water, but it was a chance, a ridiculously slim, insane chance. "The boat," I whispered, my eyes wide. Cassian's eyes fluttered open. He followed my gaze. A flicker of his old self returned, the calculating mind assessing the odds. "Too much noise. They'll hear us unchaining it." "Then we need a distraction," I said, my heart hammering. The plan forming in my mind was reckless, born of pure desperation. I took his phone from his pocket again. I didn't look for Marco's number. I went to his recent calls, the last one he'd received before we left the penthouse. The call that had set this all in motion. There was no name, just a number. My finger hovered over the screen. "What are you doing, Fat?" he breathed, his eyes questioning me. "You said that in your world, a promise and a declaration of war are the same thing," I said, my gaze locked on his. "I'm about to make a promise." I pressed the call button. It rang once, twice. Then a familiar, smooth voice answered, laced with smug satisfaction. "I assume you're calling to surrender, Marrow?" My blood ran cold, but I kept my voice even, my tone dripping with a confidence I didn't feel. "This isn't Cassian," I said. There was a pause on the other end. "The girl," Julian Valerius said, his voice tightening. "So he is alive." "He is," I said, my eyes on Cassian's pale face. "And he holds you responsible for this. You broke the rules. You brought outsiders into our business. You set him up." I was using their language, the words tasting foreign and sharp on my tongue. "He's offering you one chance to fix it." "Is he now?" Valerius laughed. a cold, humorless sound. "And what is his generous offer?" "Call off your dogs," I said, my voice dropping to a low, menacing whisper, mimicking the tone I'd heard Cassian use so many times. "Create a diversion on the west side of the bridge, something big enough to pull every cop in a 5-block radius. Do it now. You have 5 minutes. If you do this, he'll consider your debt paid. If you don't—" I paused, letting the threat hang in the air. "If you don't, I will personally burn your entire operation to the ground and salt the earth where it stood." I used his own words, the terrible promise Cassian had made to protect me. I threw them back at his enemy as my one and only weapon. A profound silence met me from the other end of the line. Then the call ended. He had hung up. I looked at Cassian. His eyes were wide open, staring at me with an expression I couldn't decipher. It was a mixture of shock, disbelief, and something else. Something that looked almost like hope. We waited, the silence stretching for an eternity. The only sound the lapping of the water and the frantic beating of our own hearts. I didn't know if I had just saved us, or if I had signed both our death warrants. The silence in the tunnel was a held breath. Every second that dripped by felt like an hour, each one stretching my nerves tighter, closer to a breaking point. Cassian's gaze never left my face, his stormy eyes filled with a raw, unguarded intensity I had never seen before. He was looking at me not as a liability, not as a witness, but as something else entirely, as an equal in this desperate, last-ditch gamble. The weight of his stare was a heavy thing, a silent acknowledgement of the line I had just crossed. I had picked up his sword and pointed it at his enemy. I had made a promise in his name that could either save us or get us both killed. There was no going back. Then, in the distance, a sound began to build. A low roar that quickly escalated into a full-throated explosion, a deep concussive boom that vibrated through the stone and concrete around us. It was followed by the shattering tinkle of 1,000 breaking windows. My heart leaped into my throat. On the bridge above, the shouting voices of the police turned to cries of alarm. Radios crackled with frantic, overlapping commands. I saw the beams of their flashlights swing westward, away from the river, away from us. Then the heavy thud of their boots as they began to run. Valerius had done it. He had taken the bait. Whether out of fear of Cassian's reputation or a cold, calculated decision to cut his losses and let us disappear, he had created our diversion. A car bomb, from the sound of it. A brutally efficient message. "Now," Cassian breathed, the single word a sharp command that cut through my shock. Adrenaline surged through me, a clean, hot fire. I moved to the heavy chain that held the boat, my fingers fumbling with the thick, rusted padlock. It was impossibly heavy. "I can't." Cassian pushed himself off the wall, a low groan of pain escaping his lips. He pulled the gun from his holster. For a wild second, I thought he was going to shoot the lock, a move that would bring the entire police force down on us. Instead, he flipped the weapon around, gripping the barrel, and used the heavy butt of the gun as a hammer. He brought it down once, twice, 3 times against the lock. The clang of metal on metal was terrifyingly loud, but it was lost in the chaotic symphony of sirens and shouting from the street above. On the 4th strike, the old rusted metal shackle gave way with a sharp crack. The chain fell away with a heavy splash. The boat was free. Getting him into it was a nightmare. He was a dead weight, his strength almost completely gone. I half-dragged, half-carried him the last few feet to the edge of the embankment, my muscles screaming in protest. The boat drifted just out of reach. "Push it closer," he rasped, his voice barely a whisper. I found a piece of driftwood and managed to snag the edge, pulling the small craft against the stone. He practically fell into it, collapsing onto the sloshing, grimy floor with a pained grunt. I scrambled in after him, my sneakers sinking into the inch of cold, murky water at the bottom. I untied the rope and, using the single filthy oar I could find, pushed us away from the wall and out into the river's current. The current caught us immediately, pulling us out from under the bridge and into the open, black water. The city was a glittering, indifferent beast on either side of us. The air was cold, smelling of rain and asphalt and the acrid chemical tang of the explosion. I kept my head down, using the oar as a rudder, trying to steer us toward the opposite bank, into the deeper shadows of the industrial shoreline. Cassian lay at the bottom of the boat, his head pillowed on a coil of rope, his eyes closed. His face was a pale, bloodless mask in the reflected glow of the city lights. The makeshift bandage on his side was completely saturated, a dark, spreading stain. He was losing too much blood. "Stay with me, Cassian," I whispered, my voice raw. "Just stay awake." His eyelids fluttered. "Marco," he breathed, the name a faint puff of air. "There's a clinic, Old Cannery District. He'll know." My heart seized. A back-alley doctor, the kind who didn't ask questions and didn't file reports. I had to get him there. I dug the oar into the water, my shoulders burning with the effort, fighting the current, pushing us toward the dark, forgotten side of the river. Every minute felt like a lifetime. The sirens faded behind us, the chaos of the bridge receding as we slipped further into the darkness. We were ghosts, drifting on a black river, leaving one world behind and heading toward another that was just as dangerous. We finally bumped against a rotting wooden pier. The pilings were slick with algae, and the air was thick with the smell of salt and diesel. I managed to tie the boat to a rusty cleat. Getting him out of the boat and onto the pier was the hardest thing I'd ever done. He was barely conscious, his body an almost unmanageable weight. I got his arm over my shoulders again, hauling him up, my feet slipping on the wet wood. We staggered down the pier and onto a cobblestone street, lined with derelict warehouses. It was like a different city, a different century. "Which way?" I asked, my breath coming in ragged gasps. He lifted a weak hand, pointing down a dark, narrow alley. "That way, red door." We stumbled into the alley, the stench of overflowing dumpsters and stale beer thick in the air. Halfway down I saw it. A single faded red door, the paint peeling, set into a blank brick wall. I practically carried him the last few feet, my legs trembling with exhaustion. I leaned him against the wall and banged on the door with my fist. Nothing. I banged again, harder, a desperate, frantic rhythm. "Please," I sobbed, my composure finally shattering. "Please, somebody help us." The door creaked open a few inches. A man's face appeared in the crack, weathered and grim, with a thick gray mustache and wary, intelligent eyes. He looked at me, then his gaze dropped to Cassian, slumped against the wall. A flicker of recognition, then alarm, crossed his face. "Archangel," he breathed. Using the name Cassian had told me in the tunnel, he opened the door wide and, without another word, helped me drag Cassian inside. The inside was not what I expected. It was a clean, brightly lit, and surprisingly modern medical facility. It was small, just a single large room, partitioned by curtains, but it was filled with stainless steel equipment and shelves of medical supplies. The man, Marco, was shockingly efficient. He and I lifted Cassian onto an examination table. Marco cut away Cassian's shirt with a pair of shears, revealing the ugly, torn flesh of the gunshot wound. It was deep, and it was still weeping blood. "What happened?" Marco asked. His hands already working, cleaning the wound, his voice calm and professional. "A business meeting went bad," I said, the lie tasting like ash. He glanced up at me, his eyes sharp. He knew it was more than that, but he didn't press. "Hold this," he ordered, handing me a thick gauze pad. "Press down, hard." I did as he said, my hands covered in Cassian's blood, my gaze fixed on Cassian's pale, still face. Marco worked around me, preparing a needle and thread, pulling vials from a refrigerated cabinet. He was a doctor, or at least he had been. He moved with a practiced confidence that was both reassuring and terrifying. This was a man who was used to patching up bullet holes. It took him over an hour to stitch the wound. I never left Cassian's side. I held his hand, a silent, anchoring presence. His skin was cold, his fingers limp in mine. I watched the steady rise and fall of his chest, clinging to it as the only proof that he was still alive. Marco hooked him up to an IV bag of fluids and another of blood. The color slowly, almost imperceptibly, began to return to his face. When he was done, Marco covered the wound with a clean, white bandage and draped a thin blanket over Cassian's body. He looked at me, his expression unreadable. "He will live," he said, his voice quiet. "He is strong, but he was close, very close." Relief washed over me in a wave so powerful it made my knees weak. I sank into a chair beside the table, the adrenaline finally leaving my system, replaced by a bone-deep exhaustion that was almost painful. Marco began cleaning his instruments, his back to me. "He told me about you," he said, his voice still quiet. "The girl in the wrong car, the complication." He turned, wiping his hands on a clean towel, and looked at me, his gaze piercing. "He also said you were his responsibility. He never said you would be the one to save his life." He walked over to a small cabinet and took out a bottle of whiskey and 2 small, clean glasses. He poured a finger of amber liquid into each and pushed one toward me. "Drink," he said. It wasn't a suggestion. I took it, my hand shaking, and downed the fiery liquid in one gulp. It burned a trail down my throat, a welcome, clean pain. "What happens now?" I asked, my voice hoarse. "Now he rests," Marco said. "And you decide what you want." He told me the arrangement, the new life. I can make the call. By morning, you could be on your way to somewhere no one will ever find you. A beach in Portugal, a quiet town in the mountains, your choice. The offer was there again. The devil's bargain, laid out on a sterile steel table. My freedom. Everything I thought I wanted. I looked at Cassian, lying still and vulnerable on the table, the steady drip of the IV the only sound in the room. He was no longer the powerful, terrifying man who had held my life in his hands. He was just a man who had almost died for me. I thought about the life being offered, a life of peace, of anonymity, of quiet flower shops and sunshine. A life without him. The thought of that life, a life where I would never see him again, never know if he was alive or dead, was not a relief. It was a gaping, hollow emptiness. In the terror and the violence, in the shared silences and the desperate gambles, something had irrevocably changed. I had been dragged into his world, but I had also found a strength in it I never knew I had. I had fought back. I had saved him. I had claimed a piece of his world, and of him as my own. I looked up at Marco, my decision as clear and solid as the glass in my hand. "And what about him?" I asked. "What happens to him if I go?" Marco's expression was grim. "Valerius broke the code. He involved outsiders. He tried to kill a man of Cassian's standing. There will be a war. Without you here as a justification, as the loose end that started it all, it will be bloody. Cassian will have to burn Julian's world to the ground just to survive." He paused, his gaze unwavering. "But he will be alone. Alone." The word echoed in the sterile, quiet room. He would wake up in this back alley clinic, wounded and alone, facing a war that I had, in part, helped to start. The life he had offered me was a ghost, a fantasy. My place was no longer in that quiet town or on that sunny beach. My place, for better or for worse, was here. I pushed the empty glass back toward Marco. "I'm not going anywhere," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "Tell me what I need to do." 3 months. That's how long it had been since I had last smelled the river mud and gunpowder in that dark, forgotten tunnel. Sometimes I would wake in the deep of the night, my heart pounding, the phantom echo of sirens in my ears. But the fear was different now. It was no longer the frantic, helpless terror of a trapped animal. It was the sharp, honed vigilance of a survivor, a memory that served as a reminder of the price we had paid for the quiet that followed. We didn't go back to the penthouse. We never spoke of it. It was a relic of a life that no longer existed, a gilded cage I had been kept in. Our new world was the restaurant, Cassian's father's restaurant. After he had healed enough to walk, his first trip had been back to the scene of the shootout. He had stood in the center of the wrecked dining room, amidst the broken glass and overturned furniture, and for a long time he had just been silent. I had stood with him, my hand resting on his arm, a silent partner in his grief and his resolve. He wasn't mourning what was lost. He was deciding what to build from the ashes. Now the cavernous room was filled with the sounds of hammers and saws, the smell of fresh-cut wood and paint. The ghosts were being chased out by the light pouring in through newly installed clean windows. And on the roof, under a pale blue autumn sky, I had built a garden. It started with 1 pot of roses, a deep, velvety red, that I'd bought from a street vendor. Then another and another. Now the entire rooftop was my sanctuary, a riot of terracotta pots and green growing things. It was my fire escape garden, reborn and magnified, a defiant patch of life overlooking a world of concrete and steel. I was kneeling, my hands deep in a bag of rich, dark soil, when I felt his presence behind me. I didn't have to look up. I had become attuned to him, to the subtle shift in the air that his proximity caused, to the quiet weight of his stillness. He was healed now. A thin, pale scar on his side was the only visible reminder of the night we had almost lost everything. A line of shared history, etched into his skin. He set 2 mugs of coffee down on the low brick wall beside me. He didn't speak, just stood and watched me work, his hands in the pockets of his dark jeans. The silence between us was no longer a weapon or a truce. It was a language. It was comfortable, familiar, a space filled with everything we didn't need to say. "Valerius?" I asked, my voice quiet. It was the first time I had said the name aloud since that night. I hadn't needed to ask before. I had seen the war and the exhaustion on Cassian's face in the weeks that followed, in the hushed, urgent phone calls he took at all hours, in the dangerous men with hard eyes who came and went from the restaurant's back door. "He's gone," Cassian said, his voice a low rumble. His associates decided his methods were bad for business. They corrected the error. The cold corporate euphemism for a man's execution sent a small shiver through me, but it was a distant thing. I had seen the bodies on the floor of the restaurant. I understood the rules of this world now. I didn't have to like them, but I was no longer naive to them. I finished patting the soil around a new lavender plant and sat back on my heels, wiping my dirty hands on my jeans. I took the mug he'd brought me, its warmth seeping into my cold fingers. We looked out over the city. It was the same skyline I had seen from the penthouse, but it looked different from here. It wasn't a glittering, untouchable kingdom below me. It was just a city, a place of brick and mortar, of people living and dreaming and fighting to survive. Just like us. "Marco told me you refused the offer," Cassian said, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Twice." "He did," I confirmed, taking a sip of coffee. "Why?" he asked. It wasn't an accusation. It was a genuine question, one I think he had been waiting 3 months to ask. He turned his head, and his stormy gray eyes met mine. He was really asking, why me? Why this? I thought for a long moment, searching for the honest answer. "Because the life he was offering wasn't mine anymore," I said softly. The woman who would have taken that offer, the one who dreamed of a little flower shop in a town with no name. She died in that tunnel, I think. You can't run from a world you've already fought for. I looked at him, at the faint lines around his eyes, at the quiet strength in the set of his jaw. And I wasn't leaving you to fight it alone. A muscle worked in his jaw. He looked away, back at the city, but not before I saw the flicker of raw emotion in his eyes. Gratitude, relief, and something deeper, something that looked almost like reverence. He was silent for a long time. The sounds of construction from below filled the quiet. "I'm reopening it," he said. "The restaurant?" He nodded. "My father, he wanted it to be a place where people could come and feel safe, a sanctuary. He was wrong about how to protect it, but he wasn't wrong about what it should be." He turned back to me, and his gaze swept over the garden I had built, over the pots of roses and lavender and herbs. "The entire ground floor will be the restaurant. The second floor will be ours." He paused, his eyes holding mine. "And this, the roof, the storefront next door, it's yours, for your shop, your dream." The breath caught in my throat. It was everything I had ever wanted, handed to me by the man who had first taken everything away. But it wasn't a gift to appease a captive. It was an offering to a partner. He wasn't just giving me back my dream, he was building it into the very foundation of his world, making it a part of his father's legacy, a part of their future. "Cassian," I whispered, my voice thick. He stepped closer, reaching out, his hand gently tucking a stray strand of hair behind my ear. His calloused thumb brushed against my cheek, and a jolt of warmth shot through me. It wasn't a gesture of control or possession. It was a touch of profound, aching tenderness. "You chose this world, Nora," he said, his voice a low, rough murmur. "You chose me. Now I'm choosing to build a world that is worthy of that choice." He let his hand fall, but he didn't step away. We stood there, inches apart, the crisp autumn air swirling around us. He was my captor, my protector, my monster, and my savior. And I was the woman who had gotten into the wrong car, the witness, the liability, the one who had saved his life. We were a collection of broken pieces and violent histories, but here, in the quiet light of the afternoon, we fit. He reached for my hand, his fingers lacing through mine. His grip was firm, warm, and sure. It wasn't the hand of a captor pulling me along. It was the hand of a man who was walking beside me. Together, we turned and looked out at the city, at the setting sun painting the sky in shades of rose and ash. The rain had washed the old world away, and in the quiet that followed, we had begun to build a new one, together.